Our last major unit was the Meso-American cultures and European contact. This was looking primarily at the Maya, the Inca, and the Aztec, and also what happened as the Europeans made their way into the New World, or the Americas. The Maya, the Inca, and the Aztec cultures were all very complex and advanced. They were in many ways far more advanced than the Europeans. So these cultures, for example, had things like plumbing, which the Europeans did not. They also had strong government, strong organizations, and they made many technological advancements. These cultures rivaled any others to have existed in the world to this point, whether any of the European cultures, the Asian, the Africans. These were very complex societies. In fact, at the point when the Spanish came to the Americas, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was by far the largest city in the world, more than 5 times larger than London. These were very advanced societies. The Maya Empire ended in the 600s, so they were long gone before the Europeans invaded. But their legacy and many of their developments and advancements remained within the Mexican culture and had been adopted by the Aztecs among other groups. Their language was one of the things that lasted. They had a very complex culture. They made significant mathematical discoveries. They, for example, discovered the number 0, which to us seems obvious, but was not. And only 2 other cultures, the Babylonians and the Hindus, had discovered the number 0 and the concept of nothing. They had also developed a written language. This is something that kind of died off with them. The Aztec and the Inca did not have written language. They also developed a highly advanced calendar, which I'm sure you've heard of multiple times recently as we prepare for the supposed end of the world. The advancements of the Maya influenced the Aztecs. So they lived in similar regions, and many of their developments, their beliefs, their customs had continued to exist in the small groups that remained. So as a large culture, they were no longer there, but they were not completely wiped out. Their descendants joined other groups and took their ideas and cultures with them. The Aztecs adopted and modified the Mayan calendar. So they also were able to keep track of time similar to the way that the Mayans did. So in Europe, as the Inca and the Aztec cultures are developing and advancing, we have Prince Henry, the Navigator of Portugal, and he's beginning the European age of exploration. He's really the one who starts pushing for training and developments so that the Europeans, and particularly Portugal, are not dependent upon the traders bringing the goods from Asia and from Africa to Europe. This took a significant amount of time, and it also became extremely expensive because you need so many people to get the goods from one point to another. So Prince Henry decides there has to be an easier way. So he starts training people to not only become navigators, but also to build the ships and really create all of the aspects that you need to have a strong navigational force. Not wanting to be outdone, the other European nations followed suit. Europe had developed and or received enough advances in learning and technology to allow them then to explore. So they've been able to borrow enough technology from other cultures who had been trading and exploring long before them, and they were able to make some of their own developments and advancements. So this allows them to not only just sail along their coasts as they had been, but they can go on much longer journeys. This starts with going to Africa, making their way around Africa, and accessing the trade routes around India and China that others had been accessing for centuries. But then this eventually took them west to the Americas. The Europeans wanted more power and they wanted more products, so they were very motivated to start exploring. As they made their way west and came into contact with the natives of the Americas, disease unfortunately spread extremely rapidly. Within just a couple years of contact with the Europeans, the vast majority of the population of Mexico, which had been estimated at about 25 million. That includes not only the Aztec Empire, but all of the other groups who were also living there. And it had dropped down to around 5 million people. So we have huge drop. So we lost approximately 20 million people in just 2 years. Their immune systems had not been exposed to these diseases, and so they couldn't fight them off. Another advantage that the Europeans had is guns. These much weakened native empires, they really couldn't fight back against these far superior weapons. They've lost so many people, the survivors themselves are weak, and so they can't fight back against those guns. This puts the Europeans in a clear position of power where they can make the native population do pretty much whatever they want. This results in the Europeans treating the natives extremely horribly. They see the natives as savages and as stupid and ignorant. Even though they're far more advanced in many respects than the Europeans kind of choose their categories for how will they determine who's civilized. Oh, well, they don't have a written language, therefore they must not be civilized. So they're treating the native population extremely poorly. They are made to work as slaves in the mines or the plantations for the Europeans, because these are extremely dangerous and extremely difficult jobs, and the Europeans don't want to do it. They're in a position of power, so they can make other people do the work for them. So the natives were the first slaves of the Europeans. However, their population had been diminished so much by disease, they didn't have enough people to do all of the work that the Europeans wanted or needed them to do. So the Europeans are in a situation where they need to find more people. The Spanish began importing Africans as slaves as early as 1518. This is before they had even made their way to Mexico, and so they started importing them to the islands of the Caribbean, and then as the native populations of Mexico and South America are decimated as well, they bring the slaves there as well. So this is how the African slave trade started. Had the Native Americans been able to resist the disease better, then the African slave trade might not have happened at all, because they would have had enough Native Americans who they could force into slavery instead. The Europeans left a strong legacy in the Americas. Some of it is negative, like the killing of millions of people and slavery. They also, though, brought a great deal of influence into the empire. So as soon as the Europeans came into the Western Hemisphere, we start seeing a huge influx of influence of Europe, starting with the Spanish and then gradually more and more of the European nations. While Spain gave up most of its claims to the area that became the United States fairly early in terms of European settlement, they did colonize Mexico, Central America, and most of South America. This is why Spanish is the main language spoken there. Because the Spanish came, in order to unite their empire, they forced people to learn their language. This was also the beginning of Europe's global domination that lasted for centuries. Now that they had gold and glory and products to control trade, they became the most dominant cultures of the time. So before, Europe really didn't have a whole lot to contribute in terms of trade and in terms of power. But by colonizing the Americas and gaining access to all of these materials, they finally have something to bring to the table. And they're controlling such vast amounts of land and people that they are now able to become the dominant culture.